Today, this is actually a message I was trying to avoid. when I read the text, you'll understand why. We were supposed to cover this a while back, but we had an Easter message, and then Pastor Sam spoke last week, and so we kind of took a detour. But for those of you that have been with us, we've been going through the book of 1 Corinthians from the beginning of the year. Our theme for this year is the new life and living that new life, and just seeing the life that God intends us to lead. And so in a similar vein, this passage comes up, and I'll try to adjust what it's talking about. But before we get into that, let's just talk a little bit silly. What are some trendy fashions that during your time period was really big, but now you look back and you're like, what were we thinking? Right? Well, what are some of those things that bring back horror stories? Like, if someone was to pull up a picture of you 10 years ago, you would freak out. Like, well, what are some of these things?
Baggy pants.
Baggy pants, JNCO jeans. Oh man, when I was in college, that was the in thing. So basically, for those of you that don't know, it would be blue jeans that, like, it would be 3 times the normal, radius or diameter. So you could actually fit 3 legs into one pant, right? And so it looked like this. Like, it was huge. I don't know what people were thinking. They still sell them. You can still buy JNCO jeans. I don't think anybody would ever wear them. But they still make them. What else? What are some other fashion faux pas?
Boot cut.
Huh? Boot cut?
Those aren't that bad.
Okay, those things, boot cut jeans, they still sell those, man. Okay, boot cut jeans. What else?
Those Birkenstock clogs.
Oh, Birkenstock clogs. What are they, like, clogs? They
Yeah,
actually
they're
made.
like slip-on clog things.
So it's not the regular Birks, it's an actual clog?
Yeah.
What, that
You
was
never saw
popular?
those?
No.
Those were everywhere when I was like 15.
Wow. Okay, I've never heard. So Birkenstock
Crocs.
clogs? What?
Socks.
Crocs.
They're still
Crocs.
Dude, they sell them, but they're not in. If someone shows up with Crocs, be like seriously. Actually, one of my pastor friends has like dress-up Crocs. So they actually look like dressy shoes, but if you actually look at them, it's got the holes. And he's wearing them without socks. And I'm like, dude, what are you doing? He's like, he wears it like on Sunday. I'm like, what's wrong with you? He's like, oh, it's comfortable, man. It's comfortable. So I'm like, all right. Anything else? Any other fashion faux pas that was popular back in the day, but now you would be like, I don't know about that.
Was it overalls?
That was popular?
I don't know.
Like back in maybe like in the south of America.
Corduroys.
Corduroys.
Girls wore it.
Really?
Yeah.
Like Oshkosh Bagosh or?
I think like elementary school, middle school maybe.
Okay, that's just kids.
Okay, I guess so.
Yeah, it's, I can't imagine an adult wearing overalls that isn't from a certain part of America.
Koreans wear overalls sometimes. I see
Do
them in
they?
the train.
You know, one of the things I really didn't so I think this was maybe about 8 years ago. And I think it's still popular, but those Korean clothes that make you think they're wearing layers, but it's actually one layer. Right? So you know how like in America it's kind of popular to have like a long sleeve t-shirt and then a short sleeve like tee all over it, right? That was kind of a trendy thing for a little while. They actually made shirts that were actually just one shirt that made you think it was an actual shirt underneath.
Yeah.
Do they still make those?
Yeah.
Why? I don't understand. You're tricking people into thinking you're wearing 2 pieces of clothing when you're only wearing one. Like, what's the point of that? Anyway, the whole reason why I wanted to bring this up is that culturally there are things that shift very quickly, right? Especially when it comes to attire, especially when it comes to what are accepted practices. Right? And as things shift, in many ways to go back actually would cause a lot of grief and confusion. But that's kind of one of the things I just want to keep in the back of your mind as we get into this text, because as I get into the text, you'll be like, what is this? But anyway, 1 Corinthians 11, 2 to 16. 1 Corinthians 2, 11 to 16. If you have your Bibles, open them up. If you have your smartphones, turn them on. If not, you can look on the screen. 1 Corinthians 11, 2-16. I praise you for remembering me in everything, and for holding to the traditions just as I passed them on to you. But I want you to realize that the head of every man is Christ, and the head of the woman is man, and the head of Christ is God. Every man who prays or prophesies with his head covered dishonors his head. But every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head. It is the same as having her head shaved. For if a woman does not cover her head, she might as well have her hair cut off. But if it is a disgrace for a woman to have her hair cut off or her head shaved, then she should cover her head. A man ought not to cover his head, since he is the image and glory of God, but woman is the glory of man. For man did not come from woman, but woman from man. Neither was man created for woman, but woman for man. It is for this reason that a woman ought to have authority over her own head, because of the angels. Nevertheless, in the Lord, woman is not independent of man, nor is man independent of woman. For a woman came from man, so also man is born of woman, but everything comes from God. Judge for yourselves. Is it proper for a woman to pray to God with her head uncovered? Does not the very nature of things teach you that if a man has long hair, it is a disgrace to him, but that if a woman has long hair, it is her glory? For long hair is given to her as a covering. If anyone wants to be contentious about this, we have no other practice, nor do the churches of God. Now you guys know why I wanted to skip this passage. So, what is he talking about? What is this, like, head coverings? What is this with hair? Did I turn? Oh, looks like the battery's dead. Hold on a sec. Sorry. I gotta switch batteries for a second. We do our own repairs here. Anyway, so. I could have just spoken louder. Okay, so. It should be, there you go. All right. So, head coverings, right? Hair. These things, we read it now, and what do you take from this? Like, what is Paul really trying to say? And one of the things I want to remind us is to stay in the vein of how far we've been going in the text. We're right now in the 11th chapter, so we've been going through a lot of different things. And just to remind you, Paul has brought up different issues. He's talked about sexual immorality. He's talked about lawsuits. He's talked about marriage and divorce. We spent a long time talking about food sacrificed to idols. And he even talked about his right to compensation. Right? All these random things, but in the same way, there was a very constant theme coming through each of these issues. And in many ways, this text is in the same vein. It's a similar issue that he's trying to bring up. And all through all these different issues, what he's trying to remind the church is it's not about you. It's not about your desires. It's not about your wants for more glory, for more prestige, for a better reputation. It's not about you wanting to indulge in your pleasures. It's not about you wanting to just fit in with everybody else. You got to think about others. It's lowering yourself and raising others over you. And that's kind of where this vein is coming from. So really what's going to happen from this text and probably the next 2 or 3 chapters is Paul is really addressing the issue of worship. And this is the first starting point of that discourse, that talk about corrections that this church needed and how they were worshiping together. Okay? So remember that we're really talking about worship. There are other things that are going to come out that I think might kind of confuse us at times, but what I want us to remember is Paul is really talking about worship. Okay? So, these head coverings, honestly, we have no idea what they're talking about. You look at all the scholars, they've come up with all sorts of different theories and hypotheses, but no one actually knows exactly what Paul is talking about in this text. Some people are thinking there might have been this hat, like this special hat that you had to wear in that culture and in that city. This is Corinth that we're talking about. Some people might think it has nothing to do with an actual covering, but it's the hair itself, right? And when it's talking about like having your head uncovered, it's actually talking about having short hair. There's a lot of different theories, but the reality is there's nothing conclusive out there that actually sheds exact light onto what Paul is talking about. So all we know is that the people that he wrote this letter to, they knew what he was talking about. We don't know what he was talking about, but they know what he was talking about. So all we can really gather from this text was there was some type of practice that had to do with your head, that for some reason in this culture in Corinth had to do with kind of bringing distinction among the genders. That's all we know. We don't know exactly what it was, but we knew that there was something that culturally everyone did to maintain that gender line. That's all we know. But what we know from the text and the way Paul is speaking is that to not follow that practice would have been offensive to most people in that culture. If you decided, you know what, this isn't for me, people in the culture would not take that well. That's all we know. So I want you to keep it in that realm of understanding of, we don't know exactly what they're talking about, but we know that choosing not to follow that would actually make people, it would actually make people question what they're doing. Right? That's all we know. So to really address this, unfortunately this text has been used in many ways for a much bigger topic. And that's women in leadership, because it talks in the very beginning about, headship, how man is the head of woman, and God is the head of man, all these different things. One of the reasons why this text has been very controversial, it's been used to support different stances on women in the church, right? And so I'm going to try to address this very quickly because I don't want this to confuse you from the actual topic. The topic, as I said before, is worship, right? But to really cover this as briefly as possible, I'm going to just summarize what are the main views on women in the church, women in leadership in the church, right? The first is the authoritarian, also known as the traditional view of women in leadership. What that is in many ways a very literal understanding of certain texts in the Bible that in many ways make it seem like women are inferior to men, and women should always be under men, and women should not be in a role of leadership in the church. That's the authoritarian view, right? Those are the guys that like the, wives submit to your husband text very well. The egalitarian view is the complete opposite. That one is the complete equality, right? So it only focuses on the texts that hint toward women being equal to men and kind of ignores the other texts and say, you know what, there are some cultural things there, so we probably should just kind of not pay attention to those texts. So that's the egalitarian view. That's the one that says women and men should be equal in spiritual leadership. Lastly, there's a complementarian view. And if you're not going to be surprised, it's actually my view. The complementarian view, in my opinion, is the most biblical because it tries to bring harmony between all these different texts. In that, it allows for roles of leadership in women, for women, but it really focuses more on the fact that men and women were created for different roles. When men and women, God had different intended roles for men and women. It's not an issue of one being greater than the other. It's more of an issue of intention, as well as an understanding that submission is a biblical concept. I'm going to cover that in a second. So a complementarian view is that it doesn't necessarily negate all forms of women in leadership, but it does bring distinction between the roles of men and women in the church. I'm going to stop there in that, and if you have more questions on that, talk to me later. Okay, so those are the three views. I'm a complementarian. Please don't call me a sexist after this. But let me just kind of address some of these things. The first thing that I want to just cover very quickly is that submission is a biblical concept. Unfortunately, this has become a very negative word. Why? Because people have abused power, right? no one ever wants to be known as submissive in today's age. To say you're submissive is basically to say you're a pushover, and that people can just walk all over you. That's kind of the concept of that word now. But if you actually look, and if you just look at Ephesians 5, this is the verse that precedes the famous verse of wives submit to your husbands. The verse right before says submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. That is saying everyone submit to each other. It's not just saying women only submit to men. It's saying everyone submit to each other out of reverence for Christ. And if you actually think about the very identity of God as the triune God, the Trinity, submission is part of his very character. The Son submits to the Father. The Spirit submits to the Son. You have it in the very nature of God himself. That within the Godhead, there is a line of submission. They have specific roles. They honor each other in that way. And so to me, honestly, submission has only become an ugly word because the people in power have abused it. Because if you actually look at the text of wives submit to your husbands, if you follow the rest of that text in Ephesians, the job for men is actually very difficult. You have to purify and cleanse your wife and make her holy. You have to place her above yourself, so much so that you're basically putting all of her needs above yours. The actuality of that text, it's honestly, when I read that text and I understand it, if someone were to come to me and say, you know what, I'm going to take care of you, I'm going to put all of your needs above mine, and I'm going to purify and make you holy, I would have no problem submitting to that person. Submission is a beautiful thing when the person who's supposed to take that role of being in the head actually takes it seriously and actually tries their best to be Christ-like in that position rather than to abuse what they think is rightfully theirs. So, Paul goes to this very long argument appealing to creation order and talking about all these different things because he's really trying to set up an argument about something that's going on at the church. Like I said before, we don't know exactly what the issue is, but it centers around something that the women of the church were doing. And so what he's not saying is that women should not be part of worship. If you look at the text, he says, when women pray and prophesy, do this, right? He's not saying don't pray or prophesy. He's not excluding them from worship, but he's trying to qualify when they are worshiping, how they worship. His issue is in the way they're practicing the worship, not in their role. And so, again, it's a very convoluted argument. But the real issue that's at stake is, what he's saying is, we must have propriety in our worship. And this is something I'll be covering in the next couple of weeks because it comes up again and again. But what that really means is that we have to be appropriate in how we worship. The key word in this entire section is in verse 11, where it says, nevertheless. For those of you that know how I talk about structure in the Bible, this is the center point of a chiasm. Right? For those of you who know that word. The chiasm, the A, B, C, B, A structure, the C is the most important part. This is the word in the very center of the chiasm. Nevertheless. What Paul has set up in this argument, he's like, you know what? He's explaining to them creation order. He's explaining to them the need for gender distinction, but at the same time, he's like, you know what? You women have your own authority over your own head. You women have that freedom. Nevertheless. This is in the spirit of the entire letter. Remember, when he talked about eating food sacrificed to idols, he's like, you know what? You guys have the freedom to do that. Nevertheless. For him, when he was talking about his right to compensation, he talked a long time about, you guys actually should compensate me. Nevertheless, that's the spirit of this letter. That's the spirit of Paul. And what he's trying to tell them is, you know what? This practice that you're doing, this whatever it is, this cultural practice that you're choosing not to do, that's your right. But nevertheless, it's not the best thing. So we don't know exactly what it is, but from what we can construct, basically the women of the church, when they were in worship, were choosing not to do something that was culturally required of them. And by choosing not to do so, Paul was saying, you know what? That's your right. You don't have to do that. But it's better if you lay down your pride and follow the rules for the sake of others. Now I'll try to explain what exactly that means. In the end, this isn't a passage you're supposed to take as something that is teaching you how to function in the church. Right? Like, you're not supposed to take this passage and be like, all right, girls, you gotta grow your hair out. you heard what it said, that's your glory, right? How can you cut your glory? Right? And then you see a guy with long hair, you're like, no, man, you're covering up the glory of God. Right? Like, you're not necessarily supposed to take this text, and Paul isn't using it to teach something that is meant to be a rule for all of the church. He's expressing his opinion. And honestly, you can tell from the way he's writing, if they don't listen to him on this regards, it's not something he's going to get that angry about. To him, it's not a big deal. But he's trying to express why they should consider what they're doing. And that's really what I'm trying to communicate to us is, when we worship in a way that actually builds up everyone else. Because worship isn't just about you. That's the message of the entire letter is, it's not just about you. And so these women who were praying and prophesying, and they chose not to do this culturally required thing of them, they were making it harder for the other people in worship to be in the same heart and the same mind. They were becoming a distraction. That was what Paul was speaking against. He's like, you know what? Okay, I understand, that's your right. You can stay that way, but it's not just about you. It's better for you to take the high road and involve everyone in worship so they can accept your prayer, they can receive your prophecy. Do it in a way that everyone can enjoy it together. That's what Paul is saying. And honestly, brothers and sisters, when we apply this to us, how we worship, you have your own individual worship in the privacy of your own homes, right? For some of us that play instruments, some of us like to do this often. For those of you that can't play instruments, honestly, I feel sorry for you. But, you can turn on a recording, it's cool. But most of the time, worship is done corporately. Worship is done together. We just had a time of worship just before this message. And one of the points that Paul is trying to get across, and he is going to repeat himself again later, is that worship is meant to build everybody up. So we have to be mindful of that. Now, honestly, in Korea, this isn't so much of a big deal, because in Korea, everyone just follows each other. Right? So it's not that big of a deal. Like in other contexts, it can be a big deal. I was at a church in America, in Austin, Texas, and then it was a very famous church. Chris Tomlin was leading worship, so very famous church. I'm sitting there, and then I'm in the back, and this girl to the right of me is doing interpretive dance the whole time. I think she even had like one of those like feathers, and she's like going around like this the whole time. And to me, it's great that she is enjoying this time of worship, but I can't help but be distracted. right? I'm sorry, right? I've been to churches that have flags, that wave flags the entire time. This guy came in with a banner that said the Lion of Judah, and he started prancing around. And again, I couldn't help but be distracted. There are times when worship can be done in a way that edifies everyone, but there are also times when it's a bunch of individuals that aren't thinking about the others around them. And what I want to remind us today, that's the heart of this whole letter, is the things that you do and don't do affect those that are around you. In the same way in worship, how you worship affects those around you. One of those funny things, depending on what your tradition is in the church, there are different practices, right? Even for us, clapping today during worship, there are some churches you don't clap, right? You'll get like death stares if you start clapping. There's some churches that don't have drums. We have them. We don't have anyone who can play them right now. There's some churches you don't stand. There's some churches where you never raise your hands. Right? And there's some churches where everyone raises their hands, and if you don't, you feel like a lesser Christian. They have those charts on like level of Christianity based on how high you raise your hands. And so you'll see that there are different cultures in worship all around the boards. But what I think the text is trying to remind us today is to consciously worship in a way that actually involves everyone, that doesn't exclude anyone. We're going to talk about spiritual gifts later, what people know as the charismata. But one of the things, just to throw it out there, is for me, I don't necessarily disagree that spiritual gifting doesn't exist. That's a whole other issue. I'll get to it later. But I do disagree with its use in worship. And we're actually going to cover that in 1 Corinthians, I think, 14. Because for me, in this vein of worship, including everyone, my understanding of worship using spiritual gifts, speaking in tongues, throwing out words of prophecy in the middle of worship, to me, I don't necessarily think it's not of God as some others say, but to me, it's very exclusive. It makes people uncomfortable. It actually makes people not want to be part of that church and want to leave. And so for me, I want us to worship. I want us to be a body that includes, that is willing to give up things that we think are right for us for the sake of others. And there's a lot of simple things like how we dress, right? Like how we compose ourselves in worship. There are a lot of things to consider, but the main thing is, it's not just about us. So that's really the main thing I want to get across. It's not about the hair. That's just a side thing. Guys tend to like longer hair. just letting you know. I think there's something biblical about it. But anyway, it's not so much about the actual practices, but it's about the heart behind it. Are we trying to be inclusive, or are we just expressing our own worship without thinking about others? That's the main thing I want to learn today. So let's take a moment to just pray into this a little bit. Again, it's hard for us to really contextualize this because this is something that only happened in that period of time at that particular place. So for us, it could be something completely different. But I just want us to take a moment to pray into, God, is there anything you want me to be more mindful of as I worship you? Are there practices in my life, in how I worship, that actually detract others? So I want you to just take a moment to think and meditate on that, and to just pray that God would help you to worship in a way that edifies and builds up everyone around you. Let's take a moment to pray into that right now. concern about our safety, without any concern of what the consequences of what that might be. But Father, I pray, Lord, that in the place of worship, in the place of coming together as one body, that you would give us a heart that is mindful of others, a heart that is willing to lay things down that might be our right, Lord, for the sake of raising up those that are around us. So Father, I pray, Lord, that you would give us that oneness, that togetherness, that unity, but also that humility to seek what is best for everyone and not just for us. Draw us together in that one spirit. That, Lord, as we come together to worship, that there would be no hindrance, that there would be nothing, Lord, that stands as an obstacle to that worship, but Lord, that you would receive, Lord, worship that is pure, that is coming directly from the heart, Lord, and that is actually amplified and magnified as we come together as a community. To draw us into that heart of worship.